thank you all for coming to the best honors thesis presentation ever. There we go. Ryan Poffenbarger has done excellent work in the field of image mosaicing, and I'm excited to hear how he presents it all to you.
Okay, everyone. First, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Thank you for the support from Colonel Hartman, the faculty in the math department, the library staff, and all my friends. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the Hungarian algorithm and image mosaicing. So first, I'll explain to you what an image mosaic is. This is a Star Wars puzzle, and it's a Boba Fett made with entirely reels of footage from the Star Wars films. So here are the small images right here that compose the larger picture of Boba Fett. Images can be interpreted as matrices, just like this one right here. So if we look at this checkerboard at the bottom, if each one of those squares represented a pixel, the matrix would look like this. 0 indicates absolute black, 255 indicates total white. If you work with color images, those entries would actually be red, green, blue, so they would have 3 values in each entry of the matrix. Before I continue, I'm going to talk about what the assignment problem is. This is something that occurs in mathematics if you have, say, 3 workers in this example and 3 jobs that you're trying to fill. Each of these workers, say Kevin, can do the 3 jobs at different costs. $1, $3, or $8 for Kevin, and so on for the other workers. The problem with the assignment problem is to find a way to assign these workers to jobs to minimize cost, or in some cases you're trying to maximize savings. So in the context of image mosaicing, we have the small pictures defined as workers and the pixels of the original large image defined as jobs. So we're trying to match the small images to the pixel jobs and minimize cost. But the question arises, what is cost in the context of image mosaicing? So we'll define it as the difference between a small picture and the pixel that it's trying to fill. So look at this image of Princess Leia right here. What we're going to do is we're going to average the overall grayscale value of everything that's contained in that image. And we'll get a color probably along the lines of this. We're going to compare it with the blackness of Boba Fett's helmet to find our cost. And that's just the difference between the grayscale values. Say this was 250 and the Princess Leia average was 100, yes, 100. The difference is 150, and that's going to be our cost. Luke, you see this picture of Luke is a lighter image on average, so we'll say the cost is probably 200. It's a little bit more further off than that spot we're trying to fill. This picture of Han Solo, however, is almost entirely dark. The cost is probably around 50, meaning that they're very close images. We would pick Han Solo to fill this part of Boba Fett's picture. Now, lots of times when we're working with images, we have an incredible amount of pixels to fill. Like a 400 by 400 image, it's not very large resolution, but it's 160,000 pixels. So we can't exactly do a small image to pixel fill for all of our pictures. We have to fill more than 1 pixel on the large image for each small image that we're using. So to work with that, we just take 4 pixels at a time from the large picture, average it just like we did with the smaller images, and compare it to the smaller image. So an example of this would be if we had a picture of 400 pixels, we could mosaic it with only 100 smaller images. We don't need 400. Now, a problem that shows up when you're using averages is sometimes the math doesn't really tell you exactly what picture is better than the other when there is an obvious difference. So you see 2 pictures right here. We have 3 AT-ATs assaulting the rebel base on Hoth, and down here we have Luke riding a Tauntaun. Now, if you compare them to this 9 by 9 job matrix and its average, we see that the costs could very well come out the same. This is an image with 2 pillars of light and 1 relatively dark section in the middle. And this is just all around kind of this color. The costs are the same, so mathematically you would assume that it doesn't matter. You can pick one or the other. But just look at this for a few seconds and try to decide for yourselves what picture do you think more reasonably matches this color scheme. So the tauntaun? Troy Emig says the tauntaun, and Troy Emig's pretty smart, so I agree with him. Now, how are we going to do that using math? Because we need to automate this when we're working with thousands of pictures. What we do is we sub-analyze the worker images. Right here we have a 9x9 sub-analysis of the AT-AT assault. Down here we have the same thing. So looking at each of those sectors, we again find the average of those sectors. So conforming with that pattern of the same color along the image, we have 125, 125 all across the board. Down here, to reflect the tauntaun image, it would be something along the lines of 25, 25, 25, pillar of darkness, and then some kind of half dark, half light, some grayness on the edge. And now, looking at these, we can tell that this is definitely the better fit to them. And keep in mind, we're not doing costs anymore. This is just the inherent grayscale values. There's more than just looking at it though. We need to find a way to we need to look at the mathematical difference between these two. So what we do is we put that information into vectors and we take the mathematical norm of the difference between those two vectors. That's kind of like when we just did a 1-to-1 comparison, subtracting the difference in the grayscale values. So if we define worker 1 as vector A with that information we got from the sub-analysis, and worker 2 as vector B in the same manner, we take the norms of them in their differences with C, which is that job vector, we find that mathematically the tauntaun picture is the better image. So we can automate that process that we did heuristically so we can make large pictures fast. So I'll go back again and explain how image mosaicing is inherently an assignment problem. By inspection, the solution of that original assignment problem with Kevin, Steve, and Curtis comes out to be that. So how do we find this? Because it's easy to just look at a 3x3 matrix, but when you're doing a 2000 by 2000, it's just not possible. So I'll start with the greedy algorithm. Looking at one job at a time until you filled all of the jobs, assign the worker that has the minimal cost. Right now, for the first step, our point of reference is the job carpentry. We look at all of our workers, we find that Kevin is the best at doing carpentry. He can do it for the least amount of money. We're going to choose him and assign him. Next, for plumbing, Kevin's already doing carpentry. He can't do more than one job, so we only have Steve and Curtis to choose from. Steve has the cheapest plumbing abilities, so we're going to assign him. And by process of elimination, Curtis is assigned to masonry. An advantage of the greedy algorithm when you're using it in image mosaicing is pretty easy to code, and it's got a fast runtime. Disadvantage, it will almost surely not find your optimal assignment if you have very large matrices. It's just not going to happen. And as you fill your jobs up with the best workers that you could find, once you get to the last jobs, you might be stuck with suboptimal workers, and you'll see like a mismatch of skill near the end. So the jobs that are lined up first get a preference with the best workers. Now we'll talk about the Hungarian algorithm, which was popularized by this man, Harold Kuhn. This algorithm will solve for the absolute minimum, or if you're trying, the absolute maximum way to assign workers to jobs. Now, before I begin, I'll define what marking and crossing out is. Those are things that are essential to this algorithm. It's marking zeros and crossing out entries. So from now on, if something is marked, it will be in green. If something's crossed out, it will be in red. So you can see here, everything has been marked or crossed out. There's a preparation step to the Hungarian algorithm. These are the first two. We just run these two steps once. The point of this is to abstract ourselves from our original matrix, which is that Steve, Curtis, and Kevin problem. So we can get a few zeros because the algorithm requires zeros to operate. Subtract the minimum element of each row from the entries in that row. That's what we did here. The minimum in this row, row 1, is 1. And we subtract it from all of the entries in that row to get 0, 2, and 7. And it follows for the other two rows. We did the same thing. 3 being the minimum here, 4 being the minimum here. now you do the same thing, but from the perspective of columns. So 0, 1, 6, the minimum is 0, so nothing's going to change. 2, 7, 8, however, the minimum is 2, so we subtract 2 from 8 and from 7 to get 0, 5, and 6. 7, 0, 0, that column doesn't change because the minimum is 0. So again, this primes us for the rest of the algorithm. We only do this once. The majority of the algorithm is spent in the main loop. And before I continue with explaining the main loop, I'm going to talk about 3 contingencies that we'll be looking for throughout our algorithm. These are things that can send us into another direction. 1, every row has an assignment. So you see here, every row has an assigned worker. This means we found an optimal solution. This is what we want to happen. This is the best contingency. Another one, there are 2 or more unmarked / uncrossed zeros in each row or column. So you can see here in this row, there's 2 unmarked zeros. In this row, there's 2 unmarked zeros. In this column, there's 2 unmarked zeros. In column 3, there's 2 unmarked zeros. The algorithm, in order to continue, needs to find zeros that are isolated in a row or in a column, meaning there's only 1 0 in that row or in that column. So this will mean gridlock, which we'll discuss how you overcome that, how you decide to get out of it later on. And the final one is there are no zeros left unmarked. So all of the zeros have been either marked or crossed out, but a complete assignment has not been made. You see here we only assigned 2 workers to a 3x3 matrix. And that means we have an incomplete solution. So going back, here's the main loop. This is steps 3 and 4, and you operate them back and forth. You go into a cycle until you see one of those 3 contingencies occur. First, we look for rows containing 1 unmarked 0 and mark that 0. This row, row 1, has 2 unmarked zeros. We can't do anything with it. The second row, however, you see there's only 1 unmarked 0, that third 0, or that third entry right there. We mark it and we cross everything out in that column. And the way it operates is you actually go all the way to the end, so row by row by row. Then you go back to the top and scan it one more time just to make sure that you still can't do anything, because sometimes things can change when you cross stuff out. So once you know you can no longer do anything from a row perspective, you switch to a column perspective. You're doing the same thing but with columns. You're looking for 1 unmarked 0 and you're marking that 0. So right here in this column we see there's 1 unmarked 0, that top left one. We mark it and we cross everything out in that row. And if you look at the other columns, you see you can't do anything because there's no column with just 1 unmarked 0. And you see this throws us into that third contingency I just discussed, which is there are no zeros left, but a complete assignment has not been made. Now how do we conquer that? It throws us into the minimum line subroutine. This is so we can shuffle the matrix and rearrange kind of our order of zeros so that going back and doing the main loop again, we can start with a different starting matrix and hope that it will end up with an optimal solution rather than another incomplete solution. First, you find the minimum amount of lines that's needed to cover all of the zeros in your matrix. And by inspection, we see that's right here. Of the uncovered entries, subtract the minimum from rows that have an uncovered entry. So row 2 and row 3, they have uncovered entries. We see that the minimum is 1 of those 2 rows. And we're going to subtract that from all rows that contain an uncovered entry, i.e. row 2 and row 3. That's what we do here. We subtract 1 from every entry. Now the next step is to add that value to columns with vertical lines, which will get rid of these negatives and make the 8, or make this 7 turn into an 8. So now that we've found that new matrix, we can repeat that main loop again. And if we follow it, just like we did earlier, we'll actually end up with the optimal assignment. And this is the one we found by inspection at the beginning. Here's a flow chart of the Hungarian algorithm. There's that initialization step. There's the marking and the crossing, which is the main loop. And the 3 things that can happen. Optimal solution, that's good, that's what we want. Gridlock, we haven't discussed that yet. An incomplete solution, which throws you into what we just talked about, which is the minimum line subroutine. So you can go back to the main loop. So at the beginning of this project, we set off to code the Gillette implementation of the Hungarian algorithm in his textbook. And that's what we did, and we were pretty happy when it was working with a lot of the test matrices we were throwing at it, like 5x5s, 10x10s. It was great. When I finally started doing it with a picture sample, so this is a much larger matrix, we kept seeing errors. And that was frustrating because when you're working with a very large matrix, it's hard to diagnose what's going on when that error throws. And the error was only being manifested in large matrices. Now, Colonel Hartman, concurrently while I was coding this in Python, was coding it in Mathematica. So I sent the large matrix that I was working on to him, and he was running into the same error. And that's how you know that it's not our fault, because you know, Colonel Hartman can't mess it up. So we found out that in Gillette's algorithm, the issue was the word arbitrary. Recall contingency 2. If there are 2 or more unmarked / uncrossed zeros in each row or column, you run into gridlock. This is what the Gillette implementation has you do. You arbitrarily choose a 0 in row 2 to continue the algorithm. So pretty much you just pick one. And when you pick that one, you cross out everything in the row and in the column. So that's really the only difference. In this case, if you continue the algorithm to completion, you'll find the optimal solution, and that's great. However, consider this matrix. You run the Gillette algorithm until you have to run minimum lines. You're making arbitrary decisions like he's told you, so you can get to this point of conducting minimum lines. When you find it, finding the minimum lines the Gillette way will give you this pattern right here. Just 5 vertical lines. It will tell you that is the way we're going to find the minimum amount of lines to cover all of the zeros. Now, from my ops research textbook, Winston and Venkataraman say an optimal solution is available. It's there. However, if you continue following Gillette's method, if you remember, once you find minimum lines, you need to subtract the minimum number of all uncovered entries. Every single entry in this matrix is covered. So the problem was, my Python and Colonel Hartman's Mathematica was trying to subtract from a set that was empty. It was trying to subtract from a null set, and it would break. We found this by Colonel Hartman running his algorithm thousands and thousands and thousands of times on random 5x5 matrices, and finally we found one that broke. So we could work with a small matrix and see what's going on by hand. Now, if we chose this 0 down here, rather than this one, which is what we chose and ended up breaking our implementation, the algorithm would have gone all the way to completion. Here's kind of a flow chart of what you can experience. Let's say every branch in this chart is when we make one of those arbitrary choices, when we experience gridlock and we just pick one of the zeros. You can be fine in a majority of the cases, but eventually you can choose a path that will lead you to what we saw earlier, which is just breaking that code. And this is significant because, one, the Gillette algorithm is actually referenced in my ops research. You guys might have taken it, your ops research textbook, if you want an explanation on certain parts of the Hungarian algorithm. And 2, this is inevitable to happen if you're working with large matrices. Anyway, we decided just to continue on with Hungarian implementations that we found online to find the heuristic differences between a image mosaic made with the greedy algorithm or with the Hungarian algorithm. In our case, we were trying to make this picture of Stonewall Jackson, and all of our pictures were being drawn from the VMI archives, except for the one with Colonel Seamers. He'll be in there soon. Comparison of methods. Now, this environment is only 4,000 pictures, or around 4,000 pictures. If you look at the Star Wars photo mosaic, you can see that they have a huge pool of images to pick from. being that episode 6 is 3,300 meters of 35 millimeter film, you have about 95,000 images. If you think of the wide array of colors and scenes and darkness that you have in a standard 2-hour movie, and the fact that it's being run at 24 frames per second, you have everything in between, you pretty much you have the color palette to work with. And a consequence of that, though, is look at these near duplicates. You have Luke reaching into the Sarlacc right here, you have Luke reaching into the Sarlacc right here, and they aren't the same picture, but they're like a quarter of a second apart. Same up here. Here's Stonewall Jackson with the greedy algorithm using all of the pictures from the VMI archive. And I'll just let you kind of look at that for a few seconds. So you see it's made all of these smaller pictures. Next we have one made with the Hungarian algorithm. Here's the two of them side by side, so you can compare. Now, you can see that the face for the greedy algorithm looks a lot more defined than in Hungarian. And that's because with the Hungarian algorithm, we are not treating, the face, like say something right around his eye, is just as important as the space around his head. So nothing is being optimized at the detriment of another. By nature of the greedy algorithm, we built it so the first jobs are up here and the last jobs are down here, and it fills it in left to right. Because his face is near the top and it's at the beginning of the algorithm, they have the widest selection of pictures and they get the best workers to fill it in. But if you look at the bottom of the picture when you see the ruffles on Jackson's coat, I'll go back and forth so you can better see it. Greedy, Hungarian. You can see that like his armpit is more defined and the creases on his jacket are more defined in Hungarian than in greedy. That's because as the greedy algorithm moves down, you have a diminishing worker pool and you start to lose image quality near the bottom. Look at how defined his comb over is at the top compared to the edges of his beard at the bottom. And in the Hungarian algorithm, his hair is uniform. Same color and the edges are pretty much the same. Anyway, I wanted to see what people thought about it. So I surveyed 54 cadets in different math classes. 47 chose the picture made with the greedy algorithm over the one with Hungarian. And of course that's very significant. I posit that it's because when you're looking at a portrait, you're focusing on the picture. I'm sorry, not the picture, the face. That's the most important part of a portrait. And the greedy algorithm focuses on that one, in this case, by lot really. While overall quality is maximized with the Hungarian. I also wanted to see what they would think with lower resolution pictures. Here are two pictures made with the greedy algorithm in lower resolution, just meaning fewer small images. And here's two made with the Hungarian algorithm. I showed it to them in 5 pairs. Within these pairs, they used the same pool of small images so that you couldn't say, oh, this image turned out better just because it luckily drew the best pictures. So this pair and this pair, this picture and this picture have matching images used to create it. Same with this one and this one. These are just 2 examples. Now when I asked cadets about those, I actually had 270 responses because I asked each cadet to rate 5 pairs. 156 of them chose the Hungarian algorithm. And this is the exact opposite. This shows a significant choice or significant preference over the Hungarian algorithm. And sorry, what I was asking was, which image, when they were looking at the pairs, which image do you think most faithfully replicates the original image of Stonewall Jackson? Now now we get into what is the worst picture of Stonewall Jackson. This is probably the worst picture of Stonewall Jackson. It's just randomly assigned pictures in a giant matrix. Now, there's a unique aspect of cost, though, when you're doing image mosaicing, in that it's not just two-directional, like more expensive cost. Let's say if you're maxing cost, that doesn't necessarily give you the worst picture. If you're minimizing cost, it should give you the best picture mathematically. But this actually is not the maximum cost assignment of pictures of workers to jobs. This is the maximum cost. There's still information in this picture. We can still see that it's Stonewall Jackson. It's just that whenever there was a pixel or a group of pixels that was black, and we wanted, and the best fit would have been to put a black picture in it, we put the whitest picture that we could find, and that actually ended up giving us a pattern with information to make a coherent image of Stonewall Jackson. And that concludes my presentation. I'd like to thank all of you guys for coming. Thank you very much.